I'm Richard Taylor from Marquette University and visiting professor at the Catholic University of Leuven. And together with my colleague, Professor Andrea Robiglio at the Catholic University of Leuven, we present to you now in fall 2014 this course on Thomas Aquinas on the nature and attainment of happiness. This is a video for class 10. It is video 10b. It concerns Averroes on knowing separate substances, an issue which we will also take up the following week. Let's proceed. In this video, I want to spell out the issue of ultimate human happiness consisting in knowing of separate substances in Averroes as understood by the Latin tradition, and then I want to critique that a bit. As we've already seen, the issue was known to Aquinas and used as a jumping off point for his discussion of beatitude and seeing God face to face in the Commentary on the Sentences, Book 4, Distinction 49, Question 2, Article 1, which we studied in detail in a previous class. There, Aquinas rejected various accounts from the Arabic and Greek philosophical traditions that would not permit direct human knowledge of the very essence of God in the afterlife on the part of the blessed. Note, however, that he did not fully complete his discussion there. His focus was on that notion of knowing, but he did not complete the discussion fully. Aquinas, instead of giving a detailed account of Averroes on knowing God, instead focused on his main topic, how the blessed could be understood to see God face to face in heaven, or through God's essence. Aquinas was concerned with providing a rational and cogent account instead of leaving this notion cloaked in mystery. As we've seen, Aquinas borrowed the notion of an enhancement of knowing that could take place thanks to a perfecting supervenience on the part of a higher intellectual form. He borrowed this from Averroes. In Averroes, this was the perfecting or enhancing of the human ability to have intellectual understanding through the presence in the soul of an extrinsic form, the agent intellect. In the soul, to abstract, raise up, to the level of intelligible in act and impress on the material intellect, which is also extrinsic, but still in the soul, the intelligible in act. So that's what it's going to bring about. And with the help of these, the individual human being is able to have intellectual understanding, which is otherwise not naturally available to human beings. But Averroes does say in his commentary on Plato's Republic, a later work in all likelihood, he says in that work that there is a natural connection between the human intellect and these two separate substances. Of course, another way to look at it is these substances, the agent intellect and material intellect, are asserted or posited by Averroes in order to give what he thinks is a cogent account of the Aristotelian issue of intellectual understanding. You will recall that we noted that this notion of form for us is found too in Alexander of Aphrodisias, though through part of whose work Averroes developed his Noetics. Aquinas took this model from Averroes' account of natural human intellectual understanding and applied it to the supernatural vision of God by the blessed in heaven. God, by grace, enhances the human intellect, here in Aquinas, the individual's possible or receptive material intellect, so that it can receive something noetically which is not abstracted from matter, namely the essence of God. In this way, God is that which is seen, quod videtur, and also that by which, quo videtur, human vision of God is made actual. Next class, we'll look closely at Aquinas' discussion of Averroes and selected texts from the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, to see just how he understood Averroes in the notion of ultimate human happiness. For now, let's turn to a valuable assigned article on Latin Averroism by Professor Carlos Steele, who will be guest speaker at our last joint class of Leuven and Marquette on December 4. That article is his 2001 article, Siger Brabant versus Thomas Aquinas on the possibility of knowing the separate substances. And you want the full reference to that, see the detailed syllabus on the webpage of the course. That article is very rich and also very complex, since in it Steele reconstructs a lost work of the Latin Averroist Caesar Brabant from the Renaissance thinker Augustinus Nifo. Nevertheless, we can use much of the article for our concerns in this class regarding the issue of knowing separate substances as ultimate happiness and as something attainable in the present life by philosophers. That seems to be the case. It seems to be the case perhaps with Al-Farabi and perhaps also Avicenna to some degree, this knowledge of separate substances, at least in this life, as part of ultimate happiness, not the whole. But that hasn't been fully discussed yet in literature, I believe. Still, let's continue. Steele recounts that Aquinas and Averroes disagree in the interpretation of Aristotle's famous remarks in Metaphysics, Book 2, that, quote, just as the eyes of bats are to the light of day, so is our soul's intellect to those things which are by their nature the most evident of all, close quote. Now, Aquinas is thinking that that which is most evident of all, that is most intellectual and most knowable of all things, is God, who is pure intellect, and that our natural ability to understand this cannot understand God in his essence, as we've already seen elsewhere, right? In an earlier class, Aquinas holds that we need divine assistance in order to see that which has a nature most evident of all, namely God as pure intellect. Put simply, then, in this regard, this difference between Aquinas and Averroes, Averroes thinks this means that knowing God, who is the most intelligible of all things, is hard, very hard, but to some degree possible. For Aquinas, it's not possible through natural means. So in contrast, Aquinas contends that by our natural efforts, we cannot attain to the knowledge or sight of God in this life, and only can do so in the afterlife if God assists the human intellect with grace in the way that we have already discussed, namely by raising up the receptive capabilities of the human being so that that human being is able to receive, not through abstraction, but receive what it is otherwise not able to receive, namely the essence of God as an object of knowing. Not comprehension, but of the apprehension of knowing. This, for Aquinas, this takes place this places on the table for inspection the entire question of knowing separate substances and ultimately God by natural means. Keep in mind now that we're considering here the Latin tradition's understanding of Averroes, which, as we'll see, is not what we find in Averroes himself. Now, in the Latin tradition, the text of Averroes was studied very, very carefully. In his long commentary in the De Anima, Averroes crafts an account carefully of his conception of the material intellect required for human intellectual understanding, and asserts that human knowing requires a separately existing agent intellect for abstraction of intelligibles in potency from the contents of sensation, and for impressing the abstracted intelligibles onto or into the separate material intellect as now intelligibles in act. We've seen this before. We discussed earlier why there must be one separate immaterial subject for all abstracted intelligibles in act, namely the material intellect, when we discussed Themistius and his importance in the thought of Averroes. As Steele indicates, however, the notion of the material intellect as both intellect, thereby being actuality, and receptivity was novel, and with other texts of Averroes led to the notion that all intellects except the first have potency, something said directly by Averroes in his commentary on Metaphysics, Book Lam. That is correct. This then was combined with phraseology regarding the material intellect, holding that the material intellect is the most receptive of all things, to yield the notion that the material intellect must receive knowledge of the separate substances, namely the angels, and also even God, through its hyper-receptivity. Hence, conjoining with the material intellect can ultimately result in knowing God as the formal, final, and efficient cause of all in ultimate human intellectual happiness. This is the Latin understanding of Averroes. I will not go into all the subtleties of the reasoning that led to this. For that, I recommend that you see Steele's 2 articles indicated on the detailed syllabus. But suffice it to say that this sort of approach that leaves religion and divine grace as unnecessary to ultimate human happiness, since that happiness is difficult but nevertheless achievable, and we compare what we talked about in Metaphysics 2, was ultimately and absolutely rejected by Aquinas. Yet that is something we'll discuss in class number 11, not here in detail. Let me now turn to Averroes himself and draw on our previous study of his thought and consider how this Latin understanding is radically different from what the Cordovan philosopher himself thought. Let's begin with Averroes' conception of God. For Averroes, God is the cause of everything in the universe, cause as form and cause as end. That is, the universe owes the unities found in it and in its substances to God, who is the perfect actuality of being qua being, toward which all other beings strive within the limits of their nature. So this is a finality as well. As final cause, which causes each and everything to have being and unity, God is the formal cause as well of the natures of things and the structure of the universe. Antiquely called the cause as formal and as final. God, then, is also creator of the universe by creation, iktira, but not creator ex nihilo, by ibdat. So ibdat is the term that Averroes refuses to accept because in the philosophical context it's used by Avicenna and others to indicate creation ex nihilo, while Averroes thought that creation was just the ongoing process of ontological dependence of all substances on God, the final and formal cause of all. By that finality, things brought themselves to being, didn't receive because it's final causality, but brought themselves to being and unity in striving for the perfection that was in the final cause of all, namely God. The primary instance of being qua being, the primary instance of actuality in the universe, toward which all things strive within the limits of their own natures. Averroes called this iktira, another word for creation, and distinguished it sharply from ibdat, and he did so in his commentary on metaphysics, which I discuss elsewhere. At the 1998 800th Anniversary Conference on Averroes in Cordoba, I presented a paper called Averroes' Philosophical Conception of Separate Intellect and God. This paper was published in 2011. The full reference is on the course syllabus. It took a while to get that paper finally published because of a number of delays, but finally it did come out. Though many scholars were not happy because some of the material in there was rather dated when it finally came out. I explained in that paper, I explained in that earlier in this course that Averroes developed his notion of the material intellect because of the needs of his account of human intellectual understanding. So I'll not repeat that here. In the Cordoba presentation, I indicated Averroes was only able to integrate his conception of the material intellect with his views on the hierarchy of intellects in the universe through a very surprising equivocation of highly questionable philosophical value. In his Metaphysics bookline, Averroes provides a sketch of his understanding of the hierarchy of separate intellects stretching from the material intellect and agent intellect right up to God, the first, the most perfect intellect of all existing in pure actuality. And the hierarchy of intellects above the agent intellect and the material intellect correspond to movements in the heavens. Now, it must be remembered that for Averroes there are only 4 causes: formal, final, material, and moving. The moving, or sometimes called efficient, cause involves the actuality of a potency, the actualization of a potency. Averroes has no room for a 5th cause that might be called an efficient cause, which acts without involving the actualization of a potency. That fifth cause is the cause of existence and creation, as subdat for Avicenna. So it can also be viewed as a cause of being of things, and was used in that way by Aquinas as well. But Averroes has no use for such a thing, because he thinks that the efficient or moving cause involves necessarily a pre-existing potency, and creation as such is not possible in this account. That's creation ex nihilo, that is. Creation as iktira for Averroes means the giving. Notice the active sense here, but in fact it should not be active here in the meaning. Means the giving of unity and being in an eternal way by God to the entire universe through final and formal causality. But of course you give through final causality by being the object of desire and fulfillment. So the term give is not properly used here. God prompts, in a sense, but that's active as well. So the presence of God in the universe, the very presence of God in the universe itself, prompts other things to move themselves toward perfection. And I add here, of course, certainly God cannot be the material cause or matter of the universe, since God is pure actuality. God is also not the form of each thing. God is not a dog or a cat, but is the formal cause by giving formal structure to things through a hierarchy of beings. In this account, all things in being strive for actuality, unity, and perfection within the limits of its species or form. Since in the heavens each mover is a species unto itself, and no one more can be identical in being to another, there must be an ordered hierarchy among the intellectual movers of the heavens. I wrote intellectual movers of the heavens because mover has two senses, one as cause of physical motion in the heavens, and the other as final and formal cause of the cause of physical motion in the heavens. The causes of physical motion in the heavens are celestial souls that are in, so to speak, the moving celestial bodies, moving them with perfect circular motion in a form of emulation or lower level imitation of higher causes. Each celestial soul is intellectual and knows, though not through efficient causality, of course, knows the pure intellect above it. Its knowing is called tasawwur bil aql, or intellectual conceptualization. So it intellectually conceptualizes the intellect that is above it, and that is its formal cause. Formal cause in the sense that the lower imitates the higher, and its nature as an imitation is derived from the higher. At its lower level, knowing is. I have to look at this again. At its lower level, a thing knowing is caused to imitate the unchanging actuality of that intellect as best it can, something it does by causing the celestial body to move in circular motion. So the perfect actuality of the intellect above it is imitated by the perfect circular motion that the soul causes, but it's an imitation of what is above it. In this case, the intellect which the celestial soul knows and imitates is one in a hierarchy of immaterial intellects, each acting as formal and final causes for its related celestial soul. Pardon me. Now, given that these intellects are not identical to one another in this hierarchy, they must be in a ranked hierarchy. The ranking is in terms of their being, simplicity, and actuality. And of course, they are intellects, so it's in terms of their intellectual understanding as well. And that comes into the notion of simplicity. The lowest is immaterial, but is itself knowing by means of a plurality of conceptualizations in itself. It knows itself not to be the primary instance of being qua being, namely God, And when it thinks of God, it conceives by tasawwur bil aql, this intellectual conceptualization. It conceives God through a plurality of ideas. Hence, the lowest has less simplicity. Other intellects above it, up to God, likewise conceive of God by tasawwur bil aql, intellectual conceptualizing, but in a more and more perfect way of actuality, with fewer and fewer conceptualizations as one rises higher to the level of God. Further, since they are beings without matter and self-identical in the activity of being and thinking, God causes each by being the final cause of each as that toward which each strives and against which each measures itself. In this way, God is also extrinsic formal cause of each, since finality and unity are responsible for the being of each intellect in the hierarchy. Again, since there is no efficient causality among immaterial entities, that is, no literal motion since there is no potency among immaterial entities, any use of the term potency or potentiality or even receptivity must be metaphorical and not used in a literal way. When Averroes writes of each of these intellects having a certain potency, it cannot then be the potency of matter. Hence, potency, when used in this context, has the meaning of receptivity via final and formal causality, not efficient causality. This can happen because each of the intellects in the hierarchy, except for the first, has in its very being a relation, or a note of a relation that looks to the first cause as its ultimate measure, as the primary instance of being qua being. That is, the individual intellects understand themselves not to be that primary instance, and so within themselves they measure themselves against the pure actuality and the primacy of the complete divine simplicity in the final cause of all, God. So, given this is the case, let's distinguish the potency of matter as potency 1 and the potency of intellects as potency 2. Now, potency 2 is not identical in meaning with the potency of 1, because the potency 1 involves matter and something that is a potentiality for being made through efficient causality or through formal causality, whereas potency 2 is something completely different, really just an explanation of the dependence of things upon God that's labeled with the notion of potency. Potency as potency 2, then, is this relation to something outside of itself, a real relation of dependence, a relation God uniquely does not have to anything outside of God. While all other things in the universe have a relation to God. God is without relation to the world. Now, we've already seen that there is a certain receptivity found in the material intellect for Averroes, a notion required as part of his account of human intellectual understanding. Still, as we've seen, this must be an intellect because it must be an immaterial subject to receive intelligibles and act, and so cannot be a body that particularizes what it receives, and it must have receptivity. So it's an intellect with receptivity. Since the material intellect does not have potentiality in the sense that intelligibles already to be actualized are in it in some way by potency, or in the sense that it has matter, still it must function as the receptive subject of abstracted intelligibles and act. This is what's novel in Averroes, this notion of the receptivity of something that is pure act already. Hence, it has some kind of real receptivity, which we can call potency 3, since it is not physical, but it is acted upon by the efficient abstractive causality of the agent intellect. Now, note two things in this regard. Now we're doing the analysis of this notion. Note two things. First, the agent intellect here is an efficient cause of some kind in abstraction that is without any receptivity in it. So it has no receptivity, but it's an efficient cause of abstraction. 2. The material intellect is posited to have real receptivity to resolve problems of human epistemology, and so a kind of potency. Let's call this potency 3. Potency then has 3 distinct meanings for Averroes. Potency 1 is that of matter, potency 2 is the receptivity of the material intellect, and potency 3 is a term used to denominate the relationship of the separate intellect in the hierarchy of immaterial intellect to God, through final and external formal imitative causality. Here is where the equivocation comes into play. Averroes claims that the discovery of the notion of receptivity, potency 2, in the separate intellect, that is, the existence of the material intellect, in the science of psychology has profound import for the science of metaphysics. He says this in his metaphysics and also says it in his psychology. That import is that now it has been proven that potency as receptivity, potency 2, exists in separate intellect, material intellect. So now that that is the case, we know that potency 3, namely, can exist in separate intellects of all sorts, and we can explain the hierarchy as one of act and potency. Clearly, this is an illicit equivocation in the use of the term potency, because the term potency has a different referent in each case. After that long explanation then of the senses of potency in Averroes, let's return to the issue of human knowing of separate substances in Averroes. As indicated earlier, Averroes put forth his teaching on the 2 separate intellects, agent intellect and material intellect, to solve issues of natural human knowing. For Averroes, on this account, aside from the primary principles of understanding that somehow come from the agent intellect, all human knowing is founded on sense perception. That is, there is no separate human faculty for some sort of intuitive knowing of non-physical things. The material intellect knows things here in the natural world, below the sphere of the moon, and perhaps in some sense knows the agent intellect insofar as it receives the activity of the agent intellect in abstraction. But there's no indication that the material intellect knows anything more. Of course, as we've seen, there is no efficient causality on the part of separate immaterial intellects, so there is no efficient light or illumination coming from those intellects to other intellects or to the human mind. Humans, however, can be drawn by final causality toward their formal perfection in the activity of intellect. Since recall, Aristotle says that's what human beings mostly are, intellect. Something caused by the final cause of all, namely God, as the primary instance of being qua being, with the perfection of actuality as that perfection of actuality that all reality strives for, that is. This human activity is the scientific knowing of all created reality, or ontologically dependent reality, and of its maker. This is best carried out in the science of metaphysics for Averroes. On page 10 of the critical edition of the Arabic text of his long commentary on the metaphysics, Averroes writes the following. The Sharia specific to the philosophers, a Sharia, a khasa bil hukamat, is the investigation of all beings, since the Creator is not worshipped by a worship more noble than the knowledge of those things that He produced, which lead to the knowledge and truth of His essence. So notice this, we understand God through the things that God has created, which leads to in truth to the knowledge of His essence, may He be exalted. That investigation which philosophers undertake is most noble of the works belonging to Him, and the most favored of them that we can do in God's presence. So the most noble and the most favored we can do in God's presence. How great is it that one perform this service, which is the most noble of services, and one take it on with this compliant obedience, which is the most sublime of obediences. Close quote. That is, For Averroes himself, there is no special access to the vision of God through the material intellect or some kind of intuition. Rather, God is known through the caused universe by science. And that activity of science in knowing God to the extent possible for human beings is the religious obligation specific to the philosophers. Further, as we've seen earlier, in his philosophical accounts, there is no provision for an afterlife of perfect happiness in the vision of God. Humans are perishable entities, and, as Aristotle has it, attain the highest perfection and happiness or fulfillment in the exercise of the highest human faculty, the intellect, for as long as and as intensively as natural human earthly life allows. This is very different from what we find in Aquinas, very different from what we find in the Latin Averroist accounts of Averroes as well. In some, as we'll see later in the course then, the Latin tradition's reading of the text of Averroes spawned a philosophical movement very different from what's found in the works of Averroes himself. The question that remains to be considered in a forthcoming class is this: to what extent did Aquinas contribute to the formation of the movement called Latin Averroism, which he worked hard to refute throughout his entire career? That is, in his initial interpretations of Averroes' conception of knowing separate substances as as the perfect actuality of human beings, in setting forth that notion in the incorrect way that it was in the Latin tradition, was Aquinas complicitous with others in the Latin tradition in creating Latin Averroism, a Latin Averroism which later on he felt it necessary to refute in detail. So this is a task for us to consider in the future, but for now this is the end of video 10b.